this pick up if I leave it on the table? No? Does it pick up now?
Oh, yeah.
Now?
Yeah.
So, I don't think you have the title of what I'm going to say. Anyway, I told Sandeep that I'm going to talk about collaboration. So the title is On Collaboration. And I'll give you some remarks about my collaborations in the past and present. So I always like to collaborate with people. I enjoy working with people, and when they are your colleagues and you're equal in capability, it's just a great experience. My first collaborator was Jim Harlow. This is when I was working with Alice Chalmers in Milwaukee. As you probably heard somebody mention that I used to work in high voltage direct current in those days. That was my Ph.D. thesis. And Jim Harlow and I did some, I think, interesting work on abnormal harmonic generation in high voltage DC, and those papers have been referred to many times. He sort of disappeared. We worked together 4 years. Well, he didn't disappear, but he disappeared from high voltage DC work. It's an interesting story. A little bit later, he sort of drifted into transformers. John Reeve, he was an expert in DC. Bill Long knew John Reeve pretty well. So one time, John Reeve caught me in the hallway at one of the IEEE meetings, and he said, "Who is J.H. Harlow? Does he exist? And did you invent him so if one of your papers goes wrong, you can blame it on him?" That's actually not true. So Jim Harlow made a distinguished career in transformers and voltage regulators. And he and I remained very good friends. He just became fellow, I think, last year. So that was the beginning of my collaborations in this area. And of course, clearly the more recent ones are with Stan Horowitz from 1970 onwards, and then Jim Thorp from 1976 onwards. Both of these originated in our work with AEP, and you have heard about this from several people. 1970 and 1976. Stan told you how we met and talked about computer relay. So a little bit of history from my perspective. This is how I remember things, and Jim may remember things differently, but I have the floor, so I can say what I remember. So I joined AEP in 1969 out of Wisconsin, and went into the computer applications department. For a while I worked on state estimation with George DePazzo and Glenn Stagg, and the online load flow that was mentioned was a trial run by Louis Van Slyke, and it was abandoned very quickly in AEP because it isn't going to work, and the most successful one was the line flow only state estimator, and that really survived well. At AEP, my managers, Glenn Stagg, and later on Tony Gabriel, gave me an assignment to work on computer relays. And that's really where my main career began in AEP. In 1975, with Stan's help, we started developing a computer relay for transmission lines. This was one of the more difficult relaying tasks, and we started to work on that. We had a nice team of people. Mark, who's already here, Mark Adamiak, he showed you the picture of Ted Lipka, and then Mohammed Ibrahim. So these three were the main stays in our computer relaying work. We also had many co-op students from different universities. I think Cornell sent us our share, and many others, and Jim Thorp was the professor of students in Cornell. Larry Guan, who has been mentioned a couple of times, brought Jim to us. And as far as I knew, Jim was a controls professor. You heard somebody say singular pencils. I really don't know what they are, but that was his contribution to the theory. Anyway, he came to us and he was in the process of changing career into a different field, and luckily for us, he selected power systems. We could quickly see that he brings us a strength that we didn't have, or I didn't have, a very strong background in mathematics and how to use it to apply to practical problems. So, in those days, we were struggling with making the computer relay as fast as possible. And we had this misconception that if we use a faster computer, we could make a faster relay. And in the end, the question came up, is there a limit to the speed with which you could do relaying? And that is a question that Jim Thorp was well equipped to handle. And he quickly lighted on the fact that the speed of the relays depends upon the noise in the signals. And he developed an experimental process to measure the signal noise, and from that determined the speed of a relay as you could accomplish no matter how fast the computer. In the end, it's limited by the noise in the current and voltage signal. And that was an important result. And this formula, 1 divided by square root of n, that came up, I think, in Bob's talk, that appears in this discussion as well. That must be a universal law of some kind, 1 divided by square root of n. It came in the relaying speed as well. So Jim worked this out, and together we published a paper that has been mentioned before called Limits to Impedance Relaying. And Jim was the first author of that, as he should be, because it was all of his work. And we always had this balance between the mathematics of a problem and its practicality. And we were very glad to have Stan Horowitz and a circuit breaker expert, Jim Beeler, collaborate with us on this paper. So on the one hand, how fast can you make a relay? And on the other hand, what good is it? I mean, in the end, they have to work with circuit breakers. So what is the balance between the need and the ability to speed up a relay? So that was a very important piece of work. And at least for a while, that was one of the most referred papers in relaying. Transmission line relaying, how fast can they be, and how fast do they need to be. I left AEP around 1982 because AEP moved to Columbus, and I had an option of doing other things, and I decided to go to Virginia Tech instead. And the PMUs were sort of in the air at that time, 1982. So we developed in this relaying work a special relaying method. The computers were not fast enough. There were no microcomputers to speak of at that time, and we couldn't handle all the computations in the little time that we had. So we discovered a new principle called symmetrical component distance relay, which could use the computer speed very efficiently, and we could do the line relaying very nicely in that window of time we had. In time, the computers became faster, so in fact, we didn't have a need for that algorithm for line relaying. However, it became clear that in the process of developing that relay, we had a process of measuring very accurately the sequence component, positive, negative, zero sequence voltages and currents in very short time, very accurately. So we could pull out that picture, that idea from this work, and that was the birth of phasor measurement unit. That in fact, this process of measuring phasors and measuring the frequency as a rate of change of angle of the positive sequence phasor, and then the rate of change of that as a frequency rate of change. So that paper also has been mentioned. I think Mark put up a title of that, and myself and Jim and Mark and Amiak published a paper, a new measurement technique for tracking voltage phasors, local frequency, and rate of change of frequency. And that was given in 1982 summer meeting, and that was the beginning. Mark said, I sent him all by himself. I don't remember that, but I think you did well. So that paper was, and that probably is one of the most referred papers, and that is counted at the beginning of PMU technology. Of course, the other missing part was synchronization, and we were struggling. This is 1980, 82, and sending a pulse across the entire network to synchronize, that was one idea. Somebody brought up iridium. Does anybody remember what iridium was? Yeah.
Motorola.
Yeah, somebody brought up iridium. But very soon it was clear that it's going to be GPS, and I'm happy to see that GPS is pretty well universally accepted as a way of synchronizing. And people ask why 1 microsecond, and of course the answer is why not? It's there for free. So why 1 microsecond? Well, it could be 2 microseconds, it doesn't matter, but you have 1 microsecond. Why not use it? So that's how it is, 1 microsecond. In the summers of 82, 83, I visited Cornell to work with Jim on some projects, and in the discussion during those days, and this is how I remember it, we were talking about state estimation. And of course, if you measure the positive sequence voltage, you don't need to estimate anything, that is the state. But then it became clear that the current measurements give you a redundancy that you didn't have just by the voltage measurements. So Jim assigned his student Kaimar Karini, and that was the first state estimation paper using phasor measurements that we published. And that again has been the most referred paper in this field. We wrote some books together. At Virginia Tech, we had Barry Weedy from Southampton visiting as a visiting professor, and somehow he was a guest editor to the something which was a predecessor to Wiley. It wasn't Wiley at that time. Anyway, he asked us to write a book on computer relaying, and then Jim and I wrote a book on computer relaying, which was probably the first book on the subject. Now there are a couple of others, but at least that time it was the first. And then Stan and I wrote a book on relaying, and that also in the same series. And later on, Professor Pai from Illinois, who was an editor in the Springer series, asked us to write a book on phasor measurement, and we wrote one in 2008. And that, all of these books were, luckily, are doing very well in being received by our colleagues. Well, we have collaborated almost 40 years now, with Stan more than 40, and with Jim almost 40, and I hope it will continue in the future. Travels together. One of the visits to AEP, Jim said that I have all this money from overhead sitting in my bank account in Cornell, and I would like to use it to go to interesting meetings. And that's how he got introduced to the Relay Committee and to CIGRE, and we started traveling together to the Relay Committee and CIGRE after, and he got to spend his money that way. There are many interesting stories about our travels together. One time, I remember we were driving from Belgium to Switzerland, and we rented a Mercedes car. And Jim blames me for talking him into that. The rental was the same as a Ford, but the insurance just about killed us. But anyway, we rented this Mercedes. And 4 of us, Jim, I, Kusum and our son Ajit have this car, this Mercedes sedan, and we are trying to get our baggage in the trunk. We had no clue how to open this trunk. So 4 of us are standing next to this trunk. Great puzzle how to open this trunk. I still don't remember how it finally opened, but we finally got our stuff in that trunk and started driving. Really interesting, 4 intelligent people trying to figure out how to open the trunk of a car. Anyway, we drove, we had great fun driving, almost 200 kilometers an hour on the Autobahn, so that was fun. Yeah, travel brings other interesting memories. We were in Belgium at an Indian restaurant, and I remember that we ordered the usual things from Indian restaurants and some bread, and Jim takes a bite of this, must have been a curry. It was hot. So he wanted to cut the heat by eating a piece of bread. So he takes a piece of bread, and that bread had the hottest chili on earth. So that didn't go over well. Now he checks everything before he eats what I say. Another time, we were in Switzerland teaching a course, and there are these cows with bells on them, and they're very pleasant, nice bell chimes all day long. And then next morning, Jim comes out and says, "What are these stupid Swiss cows? They were moving around all night long. I couldn't sleep." Well, it turns out that the lake had a buoy in it, and that had a bell on it. And it was going back and forth all night, and that's what Jim was complaining about. So they're not stupid Swiss cows. But, well, after that Mercedes experience, I think Jim finally got his own Mercedes later on. Well, Stan, Sibby, Jim, and I were in Switzerland, and Stan rents a Mercedes car. And of course, we go merrily on it. He couldn't figure out how the high beams to turn off, so we came the whole distance Stan with the high beams on. Everybody blinking at us, couldn't figure out what's going on. The next day, we get up and driving in Stan's Mercedes. And the car is driving terribly, it was knocking and engine was sputtering, and so Stan asked Jim, "Does the Mercedes drive like this?" And Jim said, "No way." So we took this car sputtering and groaning to a big town of Zug, which was nearby. And the man opens the hood and takes one look and says that, "You know, a marten got into your car because of the heat and ate your wires." So that's why it was sputtering. And another time, you already heard that how much we loved caipirinha in Brazil. We were introduced to that in Brazil at a meeting. Let's see. Bob Thomas already told you the story about Jim stealing the battery from his car and another thief coming to try and steal a tire. But you already heard that story, so I won't repeat that. We used to, well, we all enjoyed drink, and Kusum used to drink in those days. In Florida, we were at a Mexican restaurant, and we had this wonderful Mexican dinner and a pitcher of margaritas, a big pitcher of strong margaritas. We finished it. Then came the second pitcher. We finished that too. I knew I was drunk, and we were all drunk. I did drive them home. I still don't know how we got home. Jim can drink with you, but he keeps sober. One time I remember Jaime and Carlos Castro and Jim and I were in a restaurant, must have been Denver, somewhere like that. Anyway, we were having drinks, and then time came to settle the accounts. We were quite drunk, all of us. I thought Jim was drunk too. But we came out and I started making arithmetic, and I had a very complicated algorithm to figure out who owes what. And both Jaime and Carlos accepted that. Jim, no. He said, "You're cheating me." He figured out what's going on. I didn't do it intentionally, but... We can get him drunk, but not drunk enough. So, these 40 years of collaboration have been fun-filled. And I'm grateful for the good fortune I've had in getting collaborators like Stan and Jim. A few months ago, a student came into my office, and he wanted me to tell him how to form a relationship like I had with Jim, so that he could have a collaboration like we did. He wanted me to give him a formula. I could only tell him that if he's been doing good in his life, and he's lucky, he will find his friend. I found mine, and I'm grateful for that. Thank you.